Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Eli Dourado is an economist and a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. Before joining the CGO, he spent 2 years as the head of global policy at Boom. His bio is awesome as it reads like this, quote, "My fondest wish is that GDP per capita would reach $200,000 by 2050. To get there, we need lots of new and hard technology, and inevitably, that hard technology is going to be deployed in highly regulated industries," end quote. So how do we do that? How do we get there? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome, Eli.
Thanks, Julia. Super excited to chat with you.
Before we get started, I want to ask you something I ask all my guests, which is, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Okay. Well, I think your generation should be extremely unhappy with the economic and technological progress that we have made over the last 50 years. If you think back to the end of World War II and you look at total factor productivity, which is probably the most important measure of overall economic growth, it grew at a rate of around 2% per year up until the early 1970s. And then suddenly it fell in half, and it's been averaging, less than 1% per year ever since. So productivity growth went down 50 years ago, and we've been living with much lower rates of economic change for decades now. And that means that lots of technological advances that in the 60s we thought we would have by now, we don't have. So, clean energy, too cheap to meter, or, flying cars. If you think back to the movie Back to the Future 2, that there were flying cars in that, and that takes place in 2015, and it was made in the 80s. And so they thought by then we would have flying cars. High-speed air travel. Concorde had its first flight in 1969, and today we don't have it. We don't even have Concorde. We don't have anything better than Concorde or even Concorde itself. Space travel. We landed on the moon in 1969. The movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was made in 1968, thought we would have space hotels by the year 2001. Only 12 people have ever walked on the moon, and most of them are now dead. So the youngest one just turned 85. And then our physical infrastructure is no different than it was in the 1960s. Interstate highways and subways and airports today are really not so different than they were 50 years ago. So in all these ways, economic productivity has stagnated, and you guys should be very angry that the baby boomers did not give you a better situation as you're starting out.
Well, okay, I see that. I really see that. What I'm thinking, what I kind of got stuck on at the beginning was when you said that, I don't remember the exact name, but that the total economic growth or whatever, that was the most important way to measure it. Why is that?
Okay, so total factor productivity is basically a measure of how much output you get from a given a fixed broad basket of inputs. So the reason that this matters is that you can think about different ways of getting economic output. One way to get higher GDP, let's say, is we all work much longer hours, right? And so we could all work a lot longer hours and we could increase economic GDP. But that wouldn't be a good outcome because we'd be miserable. We'd be unhappy because we're working harder. What total factor productivity does is it kind of separates that out by saying a fixed basket of inputs for a given set of natural resources, other resources, labor resources, et cetera. We hold that all constant and we say, how much more are we getting out of that fixed basket every year? That's what total factor productivity is. And that's why I think it's important, because we don't want to actually necessarily grow at the expense of, things like leisure time, for instance.
And that really makes me mad because my car doesn't fly, and I wish
Yes,
it did.
yes, you deserve a car that flies, Juliet, and you don't have one because of the stagnation that we've had for the last 50 years.
Well, this is a good segue into what we're going to talk about because we're going to try to figure out how we can kind of spur that and make that happen. So, first, let's talk about the case for maximizing growth. So, in Stubborn Attachment, Tyler Cowen talks about how the importance of economic growth is often overlooked. He explains that in order for that we could make sustainable improvements to long-term economic growth even if we make small changes, and in the long term those like it will pay off and we need to make those choices today. He believes that it's also an ethical choice to make, an ethical change that we need to do, and you have agreed with this and doubled down on it at Cato Unbound. You said you called an essay, it's titled Growth Isn't Just Ethical, It Is Sublime. And in that essay, you wrote that, quote, growth is so fundamental to human well being, both directly and through correlation with other plural values, that this claim hardly strikes me as controversial, end quote. You add, quote, I'm ethically compelled to devote the rest of this essay to an account of the surpassed beauty of economic growth, end quote. I don't know. Describing economic growth as beautiful really hits me. I kind of see it as beautiful, and I feel like people do overlook it, as you've said, and as Tyler talks about. So, what is the case for maximizing growth, the economic case as well as the ethical case for it?
Well, sure. There's a lot in there, right? So
Yeah.
let's see how I can. Let's say I can do it. Let's divide it up. I think there's actually from a sort of just a purely a pragmatic economic point of view. I think there's actually two different reasons. So the first one is to note that just the size of an economy is really just a summing up of all the cool stuff we get to do. So when the economy is bigger, it means, for one, it means we all get nicer houses and better medical care and nicer cars and all of the other stuff that we consume, and more is better. So that's better. But it also means, when we're richer as a society, we get more leisure time, more time with friends, more time to read great books, more time to go on an adventure on the other side of the planet. And the richer we are, the more we get to spend our resources on those experiences that make life feel meaningful. And then it also means that we as a society, when we are richer, have more resources to spend tackling big social problems. So let's say we need $1 trillion of R&D to address a problem like climate change, or to figure out how to cure aging, or to expand civilization into space. Those public goods become more affordable when we are wealthier in absolute terms. So the bigger the economy, the better life is, and the more we get to do amazing things and solve hard social problems. But then I think that that's sort of like looking at the level of economic attainment, and why that's important. But then I think there's another reason, just sort of in an economic sense, that growth matters, which is independent. Um, which is that I think people have very strong baselines about their their economic state, or the way things are going for them right now. Right? They care a lot more about the rate of change in their life than they do about the absolute level of income. So they might be poor, but if their income is growing year after year, they can be happy with that. And on the other hand, you have wealthy countries with stagnant incomes where people tend to be unhappy. And so, I think there's a reason for this. Evolutionarily, for most of human history, there was no economic growth, and you had your whole life with no economic change. So it was kind of a fixed pie kind of society. And if your slice of the pie was growing, you were pretty happy and you didn't want to rock the boat. But if your slice was stagnating or shrinking, you were unhappy and you wanted to like overthrow the social order. Well, today, since we do have technological change, we can deliver to everyone a state of affairs where their income is growing year after year. And that can happen because the pie is getting bigger overall. And so, since everyone's piece of the pie is bigger than it used to be, everyone's pretty happy, and you wouldn't get a lot of populism and demagoguery. But when you have stagnation, that means that the pie isn't growing as fast as it could, and that's when you can get some really bad political outcomes, Things like you wouldn't know any populists that get elected, would you? Um, basically, I think it's actually like more socially stable to have a higher rate of economic growth because everyone is happier with sort of like their own situation and their own life.
That that sounds like a wonderful thing. I don't know. I can't see anything wrong with that really, but I mean, while I don't see it as something that could be controversial and while you don't see it as something that can be controversial, people still argue over this or even worse, they don't talk about it at all. So, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that people are just extremely complacent. And I think what we know is that this started, in the 1970s, that this slowdown started, and a lot of things happened in that time period. Levels of regulation went up, fertility dropped, dependence on oil imports increased. Vietnam created a lot of disillusionment with America. The environmental movement took root. The civil rights movement was, of course, very important. And so I think there was a lot of cultural changes going on then, and I think we started focusing on a lot more, really genuinely negative stuff that was going on: the racial injustice at home, the violence in Vietnam, pollution, and I think Americans got a picture of the world and of themselves really that was a lot darker, and sort of we started, to not really trust ourselves to do good things in the world. And we put on the brakes with a lot of regulation and a lot of mistrust of business, and we lowered our expectations for economic progress. So the you had the optimism and the can-do spirit of the Kennedy era, where we committed to put a man on the moon, and then by the time we actually put a man on the moon in the late 1960s, that was almost all gone. So I think culturally we have a kind of complacency and a cynicism about economic growth that we haven't been able to shake.
It seems to be this weird juxtaposition between what you were saying earlier about people wanting to increase what they get, and people are happier if their incomes increase a bit but year by year compared to if they're just wealthy all the time and like make the same amount. It's weird because you would think, okay, well, people want more. Can't they see that? I don't know. It's just a little thought. So you mentioned the 1970s and how that's kind of when this growth slowed. What what other trends have there been? How has economic growth changed in the past, like, I don't know, 50 years?
Well, the main thing I would say that's happened, let's say even in the last, say, 30 years, is we've actually had pretty good economic productivity growth in a lot of areas like IT, right? And phones, the internet, computers, uh, television screens have gotten a lot cheaper than they were, 20, 30 years ago. And so there's a lot of ways in which there still is visible rapid technological change, but it's just in this one sort of domain that's sort of like electric stuff, um, not sort of in a sort of broad based way. And so I think this is another thing, is that people kind of think about the modern world and they're like, oh, it's changing so fast, but they're not really thinking about all the ways that it's not changing.
What is slowing us down?
Um, well, that's a good question. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and here's how I think about it overall. So you have that uneven productivity stagnation, right? Where some areas like TV and computers and the internet are going fast, but then some other areas are going slow. And there's kind of four main areas that I think that are going the slowest, that are having the sort of the worst productivity growth in. And those are health, housing, energy, and transportation. So health is now 18% of GDP. So 18% of the economy is devoted to healthcare. Housing has grown to 16%. And of course, in major cities like New York and San Francisco, it's often much higher than 16% of the economy. On energy, we were supposed to have clean energy, too cheap to meter. That was the vision in the 1960s. But now, our actual CO2 emissions are still going up in most of the world, and it's definitely not too cheap to meter. And then on transportation, we don't have supersonic flight, we don't have flying cars, we don't really have autonomous cars yet, though maybe we're close. We don't have high speed rail. Basically, we have the transportation system of the 1960s with some improvements in safety and efficiency. And then, of course, if you include space in transportation, we still haven't colonized the solar system yet, so that's disappointing. And so those are the key sectors to look at. And what I do in a lot of my research is I kind of look at those sectors and I say, what is stopping progress in those sectors, and especially are there common unifying reasons why there is stagnation in those sectors? And one obvious thing is those are all highly regulated sectors, right? You can't just start up a new hospital in a sort of like laissez-faire way and expect to be able to get away with it. And so you kind of have in all those four sectors, you kind of have to get government permission to basically do anything. And so one specific rule that I think cuts across a lot of the areas is permitting. So there was a law that went into effect on January 1st, 1970. So the timing fits. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or sometimes called NEPA. And this law says that before any federal agency can make any decision, any major decision, if the decision has a significant impact on the environment, the agency has to create a detailed statement of what those effects are. And this basically just slows the whole process down. These statements that they have to produce take 5 years, sometimes longer to go through. They're hundreds of pages long. And then even if they aren't going to have an impact on the environment, they often have to complete another document called an environmental assessment, which also is hundreds of pages and takes years to document that they're not going to have an effect on the environment. And then on top of this, even though this law, technically applies only to federal agencies, the problem is that even if the agency is just approving a private action, then they also have to, that also counts as a major agency decision that they have to justify in this sort of through this environmental review process. So basically, every time you have a private innovator who wants to do something in a highly regulated area, and when they have to go ask a federal agency for permission or to make a new decision that says they're allowed to do that, the agency has to do a 500-page document that takes years to approve it. So, so let me give you a specific example. So there's this guy, Elon Musk. You may have heard of him, who founded SpaceX and Tesla. But he also has, yeah. So he has a company called the Boring Company, right? That builds tunnels, and they want to build a tunnel from DC to Baltimore, and that tunnel would take high-speed electric cars and shuttle them between downtown DC and downtown Baltimore in about 15 minutes, all underground. And so they are ready to go, and they want to do this, but they're planning to dig the tunnels under the sort of the public right-of-way that's under the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. And that means that they need to get the government to approve that plan, which means that it's a major decision of a federal agency, which means that the agency either has to document the environmental impacts or show that there aren't any, and that takes years. And so basically that's where we're at on that project. It's like the Boring Company is ready to go. They've produced an environmental document that says, like, here's why we don't have significant environmental impact. And it's just sitting around waiting for years for this to get approved so that they can start digging. So I think that laws like that, I see them coming up across, and NEPA in particular, coming across lots of stuff in transportation, lots of stuff in infrastructure, in energy, in forest management. So if you think about like why there are fires all over California, it's because the Forest Service has to go through this process when they decide they want to manage the forest. So this, I think, a big part of the solution, one of the several ways to increase productivity growth, is to find solutions to NEPA, to reform or repeal it, or to find all the other laws on the books that are holding back progress in those key sectors that I talked about: health, housing, energy, and transportation.
I can't imagine that those papers, those like 500-word reports, are even like, I don't know, not specific, but that they're really accurate, because I feel like you can't know the full extent to which something is going to impact the environment, positive or negative, until it already is happening. Like
You
you can
know,
kind of start to guess, but I
yeah,
don't know.
but there's been a ratchet, Julia. If you don't include something and you say we don't know it, then an activist group can take the agency to court and say, well, why don't you know it? Why don't you do some studies and like figure out the answer to this? And that just makes the environmental impact statements even longer, right? So the court says to the agency, okay, go figure this out, and then come back to us, and then you can move forward with your project. So it's a way that activists have used to sort of exercise a veto right on all kinds of projects that they don't like.
That's crazy. I had no idea that that was like that, and that people could just that activist groups could come in and be like, "Nope, I you can't not know." What? What?
Yeah, it's a basically they sue under the Administrative Procedure Act that says that the agency has to have follow certain procedures to in order to make a decision, and they're able to sue, and the remedy is only just holding it up until the report is fixed. But a lot of times people get discouraged, and they sort of give up on the project, or the financing goes away, right? So if you're doing a project that requires outside funds, your investors want you to have a return in a reasonable time period, and it makes a big difference whether that time period is 3 years or 8 years, right? And if there's 5 years of environmental impact statements in between, then that can be a sort of that can either make or break a project in terms of whether it's viable.
You mentioned reforms of this sort of thing. Over at Cato Unbound, you also talked about your vision for maximizing growth. What I was fascinated about was the fact that it didn't involve the usual refrain from free market advocates about cutting taxes, which I don't know, it just really surprised me and kind of inspired me in a way, because for me, I'm like, oh, I know that that's a good solution, but no one seems to listen. So what else can we do? And that's kind of where you went. You had a list of 7 policies that we should pursue, such as allowing in more immigrants or getting rid of social engineering through the tax code and tariffs and stuff. But today I want to talk about some of the things that were most intriguing to me and the most potentially powerful solutions you listed. You were talking about how cities were like a big sector that you have to look at in terms of economic progress and maximization. And this really caught my eye because I talked to Ed Glacier about cities. And so I was like, oh, I know all this. Like, I've read about this, I've learned about this. And so you talked about unzoning and removing parking minimums, allowing denser and taller development, stuff like that. And you kind of touched on it earlier, but what are other things that you talked about in there that are important and could be done?
I don't actually remember what I wrote in there, Juliet. So you might have to give me a hint. I don't have that up right in front of me. Um, so let's see. So I think there's a lot of things we can do. I think just sort of prioritizing sort of the unsexy things. I think like permitting is a huge thing. Especially like in cities. So I talked about permitting in terms of like these major infrastructure projects, but permitting in cities is also very important. And there it's through the zoning code, right? Instead of through it's not usually NEPA that's holding up sort of the decision to build in a city. It's the local zoning code, and again you have a lot of NIMBYs who are exercising veto rights essentially through their city council, and sort of reducing uh, that that barrier and enabling people to actually build housing would actually reduce the cost of housing pretty significantly. And I think I said earlier, housing is 16% of GDP. So if we could, and a lot of that is just the land costs. So if you could reduce the cost of uh, of housing, a significant amount, that's just more wealth that we all have to spend on other things.
Another thing that you mentioned was accepting lower levels of safety when building new infrastructure or developing new drugs or going into a new era where new technologies are emerging. What's so important about that? I hear lowering levels of safety, and that kind of sounds not great, but I expect that it's good.
Well, okay, so we're recording this in the middle of a global pandemic, right? And you mentioned drug safety. So let's look at it from that angle. You know, we all want our drugs to be safe, right? But they also have to actually be available on the market and have to actually be something we can try. So a drug that is held up for safety reasons, uh, and therefore not available, is it can be just as bad and just as dangerous as a drug that is maybe less safe. You can die from not having the medication as well as from having bad medication. And so in this global pandemic, there is a real need for moving quickly, right? For figuring out drugs that probably work, and maybe we're not certain that they work, and maybe we're not 100% certain that they're safe, but we're going to make them available to a lot of people, to sort of take and use their judgment about whether it's worth the risk to take. Um, that that would create a lot, especially in a pandemic where there is this contagion element, where the virus can spread uh, significantly uh, from people, spreading it amongst themselves. If you take out some of those populations because they've tried an experimental vaccine, let's say, then the virus spreads a lot less rapidly. So moving more quickly and accepting a lower level of safety could actually save a lot of lives in aggregate. And so it's basically, don't there are certain situations where you don't want to apply your normal operating procedures or your normal safety standards, and let's look at situations like a pandemic, or when you're dealing with a brand new technology that could be world changing, but it needs to be able to get off the ground. You need to soften up. And I think about a lot of things that probably wouldn't exist today if they had to meet the safety standards that we have today. So like automobiles, they are, something like 40,000 people a year die in automobiles, and when they were first introduced, they were even less safe. So imagine if we took today's high safety standards and applied them to the early automobile when it was first introduced to the market. It would never have met those standards, and we would have never gotten the automobile at all, right? And similarly, there are drugs like aspirin that we all take all the time, and it's available over the counter, that probably wouldn't have gotten through the FDA approval process, if it had existed at the time that the drug was being discovered. So I think that there are, safety is important, but it's not the only value, and especially in areas of emerging technology, or in emergencies, you need to be able to soften those standards a bit.
I feel like if I were told by a doctor that I was going to die in like 2 weeks and the only option was some sort of like drug that hadn't been approved, but like it was still available for some reason, and it was like experimental, like no one knew if it actually worked yet, but like tests showed that maybe it would. If I'm going to die anyways, I would rather try, I would
Yeah,
think. but I don't know. At least to have the choice to maybe try if I wanted to. That's I like that.
Yeah, and but then I mean I think apply that not just to drugs but to other things. So do you want to be able to have other things that could radically improve your quality of life that haven't been proven yet? To what extent should you be able to make that decision for yourself um, versus a regulator imposing it, bearing in mind that it's not just that's not the only thing that the regulation is the only it's not the only thing that the regulation does that makes it safer. It also delays and adds expense to the whole investment process and the product development process.
Something else you talk about is that we should spend fewer resources, quote, showing that we care, end quote. This made me laugh a lot. I was just like reading it and I was like, oh my gosh. But what do you mean by the resources that we spend showing that we care, and how can we like lessen that?
So great question. So that was a nod to the economist Robin Hanson, former professor of mine, still a friend of mine, who this is part of his theory of a lot of like why medical care is so expensive, is that we feel like it's important to do the sort of the maximum gold plated treatment all the time, even though that gold plated treatment might not be effective um, or evidence based. And so there's a bunch of different studies that go into this, but I think the sort of the most famous one is the Rand health experiment. I think this was done in the 70s, but basically they randomly assigned some people to have health insurance and other people to not have health insurance, and the health outcomes for both groups were the same. The people with health insurance like went to the doctor more, but ultimately in the end the populations had the same amount of sort of health outcomes. And so a big issue in healthcare so far, that we have today is we probably know that a big chunk of what we do isn't effective, and we don't always know which chunk it is, and that's the problem. And so just sort of just a little bit a little bit less, a little bit more skepticism in medical care, instead of just saying like, oh yes, gosh, I will do whatever it takes. Um, might be a good cost cutting measure.
This makes me think of an option where you have two possible cures, and one of them is really, really safe. You have to take 3 pills a day for the rest of your life, and you have to get a minor surgery once a year, but it's no risk, but it is a nuisance. And the other one is a big risk surgery with like a 50% rate of being cured. But if it works, you're cured for life. And it's them saying, you will take this one and I want this one because this is the best possible thing and I will be cured then. But not necessarily. Like the other one is just as good.
Yeah, people are really, there's something about health that makes people very afraid. Healthcare decisions and stuff that makes people afraid and makes them willing to take the most expensive treatment. Even people who wouldn't normally, buy the gold plated, the really expensive car or something like that. They want the gold plated health insurance plan, or they want the gold plated treatment when they actually get sick. And so, um, that might just be a reality of human nature, that that's what we want, but it doesn't seem to be the most effective or efficient outcome.
So you also have argued that we should be spending more on basic research. You recently wrote a piece for Works in Progress magazine advocating for putting a really big telescope on the moon. First, I wish everyone would read it because it tells a really fascinating story about radio astrology, which I hadn't really looked into before. So, why are you really excited about that?
Well, so I think a telescope array on the moon is super cool and solves a major problem in radio astronomy. So essentially, radio astronomers want two things. They want really big instruments, telescopes and telescope arrays that give them very high resolution images and observations. And then the other thing that they want is no interference. And sometimes that's no interference from like human activity on Earth, but and other radio signals. But a big chunk of it is just no interference from the atmosphere, from Earth's atmosphere. And so that creates a problem because the only way that it can get really big instruments is through these big arrays. And the only way they can get no interference from the atmosphere is by putting telescopes in space, but they can't do both at the same time in general. There are space telescopes, but there's no space telescope arrays. So the only way you could solve this problem is by putting an array, a radio telescope array, on the far side of the moon, where there is no atmosphere, but there is ground. So you could keep the sort of the distance between the telescopes known and constant. So I think it's exciting because a telescope array on the moon would allow us to do so many cool things. But let me just talk about two of them, which I wrote about in the piece. So the first one is that it would let us see back in time to the early universe. So as you know, there was, the universe started with a big bang. There was this sea of protons and electrons that coalesced into molecular hydrogen. There was just, so for a period after the big bang, like all there was like hydrogen. And then the hydrogen coalesced into dense clusters that today we call stars. And the gravity, the intense gravity of the mass of the stars set off a fusion reaction. And that's what makes the stars shine or emit energy. And what this means is that there was a time in the universe before the stars started to shine, when they hadn't coalesced enough to create a fusion reaction and start shining. So this period before there were any stars that had ignited is called the Dark Ages, where basically the only normal matter that there was just molecular hydrogen. Well, hydrogen molecules have an interesting radio signature. So essentially, they frequently undergo these state changes that cause them to emit a photon at a 21 centimeter wavelength, exactly 21 centimeters. So if we could observe that signal, we could learn a lot about the early universe. But as you may know from science class or something, the universe is expanding. And so that means that the photons emitted 13.6 billion years ago by hydrogen molecules, they've gotten longer wavelengths over time as the universe has expanded. And so now they're more than 30 meters long. And that those 30-meter wavelengths can't enter the Earth's atmosphere. So we're completely shielded from them. Like no human has ever observed the 30-meter wavelength spectrum. So we've never gotten to see this radio signature from the Dark Ages, this time before the stars lit up. And there's so much that we could learn from it, and, especially about the nature of dark matter and dark energy, which seem to make up most of the universe. And we could actually observe this signal if we had a telescope array on the far side of the moon. It would be, it wouldn't be blocked by the atmosphere, and we'd be able to see this signal from the time before the stars lit up. So I think that's really cool. And the other thing we could do with it is we could look at much closer to home. We could look at planets in sort of nearby star systems, sort of within a radius of about 30 light years. And a big question that a lot of people have is, why are there no aliens, or at least none that we can see so far? And by just looking at nearby planets, understanding how many of them are rocky, how many of them have magnetic shields, how many of them have atmospheres, what is their solar weather environment, that would help us to better understand some of the key parameters for how frequently we should expect life to emerge in the universe. And so it helps us, understand why we don't see aliens, or how often should we expect to see aliens. And it could even help us find good candidates for alien civilizations that might be there. So suppose that we find that in most star systems they have 0 or 1 or 2 two planets rather that have oxygen atmospheres. And then so we survey hundreds of stars, and that's what we find. It's 0 or 1 or 2 planets that have oxygen atmospheres. But then we find one, and it has 7 planets, and they all have oxygen atmospheres. like, wouldn't that make you a little suspicious, right? It would make you think like, okay, maybe that's a coincidence, but maybe an alien civilization lives in that star system, and maybe they've terraformed the planets to create oxygen atmospheres, because that's exactly what we would do if we got to Mars. We're going to get to Mars at some point, and we're going to sort of build up the atmosphere and try to add oxygen to it, and make it more robust against solar wind. And so we know what we're going to do when we get to Mars. If we see another star system that has planets where it seems like all the planets have had this done to them, then that is I would say, a good candidate for further research.
That's so cool, and I feel like you explain it so well. I'm so interested by science, but a lot of the time I'm really confused because I try to read about it and then I'm like, "What is this talking about?" But you just explain it so well that I feel like anyone can really understand it, which is I'm very grateful for that. So my question then, which kind of follows what we've been talking about, is why don't we have a telescope on the moon if we landed over 50 years ago?
So good question. I think that the biggest reason that we haven't had as much progress in space generally is procurement rules, or procurement practices. So procurement is just like how the government spends money to get things, right? So if the government wants to, needs a big rocket to take people to the moon, they do a contract with, a space contractor who who builds the rocket, and that enables, NASA to fly to the moon. And most of the spending that we've done for our big space programs has been in the form of these contracts that are called cost plus. And so that just means that the NASA agrees to pay whatever it costs the contractor to make the rocket, and then plus a little bit extra on top as profit for the contractor. But the what the contract does is it creates an incentive for the contractor. Like, they never have to try to cut costs; they'll just get reimbursed for any costs that they that they incur. They always try to expand the scope of the program. Um, so that dynamic means that you never get an efficient, like, cost cutting sort of innovation that happens over and over again. You get instead these one-off programs where they're very expensive. The contractor doesn't operate very efficiently. Like, in the end, the product is probably pretty safe because the contractor, after all, doesn't have an incentive to cut corners at all, right? They're going to spend every dollar they can, and if they can argue that they can spend more money to make it more safe, they will.
Mhm.
But then you get things like the space shuttle, which in today's dollars costs $1.8 billion per launch, or you get the International Space Station, which costs $150 billion to build in today's money. That's actually the most expensive structure in the world, or in I guess out of the world too. It's the most expensive human structure ever. And those were cost plus contracts where companies like Boeing got paid a lot of money to build the items as inefficiently as possible. And so if we want stuff, like the Lunar Telescope Array, the way to go and to get more space stuff done in space in general is negotiate a price with the contractor and say, like, this is what we're paying, and you've got to deliver the product. And then that creates an incentive for the company to try to do it as efficiently as possible and build on past success and innovate, and it drives progress, right? And so a company that has done that is SpaceX, which has done all of its work for NASA on a fixed price contract. And today you can launch a Falcon 9 rocket. You can just go to SpaceX and say, I would like to do a rocket launch on your rocket. And they'll say, okay, it's $50 million, and that's the price. And you can just pay that, and you can launch. And that's way cheaper than, the space shuttle at 1.8 billion. So basically, by making space more commercial, we'd get a lot more science, like things like lunar telescope arrays, and we'd also get a lot more colonization. We'd probably be on our way to becoming a multiplanetary species by now, which I think is also really exciting.
I feel like if we're also really worried about safety, the money that's not used to like overpay everyone to be super extra safe and be super inefficient, even like a sliver of what isn't paid, not even all of it, could be spent on hiring someone to make sure, and like so we can hold them accountable. Like I don't know. I feel like there are ways to like rearrange the spending. Like I don't know. I feel like there are ways to maintain the safety aspect without being super inefficient, even if it's not just completely what happened with SpaceX. But I think that's so cool. I kind of want to launch a rocket. I definitely don't have that kind of money, but like I would love to do that.
Well, they're
What?
getting there are small rockets that are way more affordable. That's one of the big ones.
Maybe I'll have to save for that. No,
Yes, you
probably
can
not.
launch your own satellite.
I think I wanna go to college more than buy a
Okay.
little launch. I think that's what I'm choosing. So as a conclusion, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Good question. So, when I was your age, it was the 1990s, and my family had had internet access for only a couple of years. It was kind of a new thing. It was really exciting technology for me, and I really thought that the internet would matter a lot more than it ended up mattering. I thought that it would be transformative, not just for communications, but also for society and for human freedom. And I remember that in 1996, John Perry Barlow wrote a document called the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, where he basically said, governments are never going to be able to control the internet. And that was, really attractive idea. That the idea that the internet was inherently liberating, and I felt pretty compelled by it. Not just for the 90s, but even in the decade after. But like, if you think about what we've seen, not only are governments regulating online activities, but some of them are using it to surveil their populations. So you see that in China a lot, where they're basically turning the internet into a system of almost total control over people. Um, and then I think the other piece of it, aside from the liberty piece, is that we thought that the internet was going to be this massive driver of economic change, and it has been a bright spot, I think, but it hasn't really fundamentally replaced the need for all the improvements that we need in the physical world. And I think things like energy technology and health and housing and transportation, right? Like those are all areas where the internet, the impact of the internet is limited, or of IT in general, of information technology in general in those areas. And so, or maybe they won't be in the future. Maybe certainly they could improve a lot by leveraging IT a lot more. But I just thought IT, sort of IT by itself was going to do a lot more, and so far it hasn't, and we're still stagnating.
That's such an interesting answer. I don't know. I mean, I don't it's not that I don't think about stuff like this, but I was born with the internet. I never thought, "Oh, is the internet going to change the world?" The internet is the world, kind of. Like, not really, but it is at the same time. So that's I don't know, that's an interesting response. Thank you so much for being on my podcast. I had such a great time, and I feel like I learned a lot. I know that my listeners are learning a lot too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Juliet. It's been great.
Of course.